All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be taking a look at something pretty fundamental.
Okay.
We're talking about loyalty.
Hmm.
It seems like one of those things it's built into us, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
almost instinctive. But then, like, when you start to really kind of look at it closely
Right.
and think it through, like, all of a sudden you end up with all these, like, really fascinating philosophical questions
Yeah.
that I don't think most people would expect to be there.
Yeah.
And you, as a deep dive listener, I know that you're the kind of person who likes to really get to um, the heart of complex ideas pretty quickly.
Hmm.
And so that's really what our goal is today. You know, we want to give you a sense of, all of the complex things that philosophers have thought about when it comes to loyalty.
Yeah.
But we want to do it, we want to do it quickly. We want to do it concisely.
Well, it's interesting that loyalty is something that comes up not just in, our sort of everyday personal lives, but in all sorts of different contexts.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you see it talked about in literature, obviously, but also business strategy,
Right.
even, psychological studies.
Yeah.
I mean, there's psychological studies of loyalty.
Yeah.
You see it in sociology and political science. It's kind of everywhere.
Yeah.
And yet it's kind of remarkable that mainstream philosophy historically only really started to grapple with this
Yeah.
in a deep way, relatively recently. I mean, there are a few exceptions. Josiah Royce is a very notable exception to this, but on the whole, it's really only in the past few decades that philosophers have really started to pay a lot of attention to this concept,
Right.
and that I think makes this deep dive especially interesting. We're really exploring a terrain that's I think in a lot of ways still being actively mapped.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think it's kind of like, it's a concept that's hiding in plain sight. We all use it. We all think we know what it means.
But when we really start to, like, poke at it,
Mm.
and try to pin it down, then all of a sudden we're like, oh, wait a minute, this is much more complicated than I thought it was.
Right.
So let's just get started then by clarifying what exactly we're talking about. Right?
Mhm.
What is loyalty? When we talk about loyalty from a philosophical perspective, like what's the actual definition?
Yeah, so the definition that a lot of contemporary philosophers find really helpful is this. Loyalty is a practical disposition to persist in an intrinsically valued associational attachment, involving a potentially costly commitment to the object's well-being.
Okay.
Now, there's a lot packed into that definition, right? I mean,
Yeah.
first of all, it says practical disposition. Now, that kind of right away signals that we're talking about something more than just an emotion or a feeling.
Right.
Right. It's a disposition to act. So this already sort of hints at the fact that there's a debate within philosophy about whether loyalty is primarily a sentiment or whether it's primarily a practical disposition.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people, when they hear the word loyalty, the first thing that probably comes to mind is some sort of feeling.
Yeah.
I mean, we talk about, oh, I feel loyal to this person, or I feel loyal to that group. So is there a sense in which that's actually wrong?
No.
I mean, is the emotional component just sort of like a sideshow?
Yeah. So here's the interesting thing. While emotions are very often present when we're talking about loyalty,
Right.
the question is whether those emotions are really the core of what loyalty is, or whether they're sort of more of a byproduct. And the way that a lot of philosophers tend to think about this is to say that the real test of loyalty is conduct. Right. It's the stick-to-itiveness, the perseverance. It's that willingness to stick with whatever it is you're loyal to, even when it's inconvenient, even when it might be costly to do so. So you might feel loyal, you might have all of the right feelings, but it's what you do that really counts as the true test of loyalty.
That's really interesting. So it really is a question of not just how you feel, but how you act.
Right.
So somebody might say, oh, I'm super loyal to this friend of mine. But then, when push comes to shove, they're nowhere to be found.
Right. Exactly.
And so there's this sense in which, yeah, it's not just about having, the warm fuzzies or something like that.
Yeah.
It's about it's about action.
Right. It's about the doing, not just the feeling.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. Now, but then there's also this other side to it, right? I mean, it's one thing to sort of to do something loyally,
Mm-hmm.
but is there any sort of thinking behind loyalty? I mean, is it just sort of blind following? Or can it be rational?
That's a great question. And this gets to the heart of what it means to be a reflective being, right? I mean, we don't just act on instinct.
Right.
We think about our actions, we think about our commitments. And so, yeah, there's definitely a place for reason within the concept of loyalty. Now, it's true that acts of loyalty might not always seem rational, right?
Uh-huh.
Especially if you're just thinking about, what's going to get you the most benefit in that moment. What's going to be the most advantageous thing to do. Sometimes acting loyally might seem like it's actually costing you something. But here's the thing. That initial decision to become loyal to something, right? Whether it's a group, a cause, or another person, that initial commitment can certainly be based on reason, right? I mean, you typically don't just, commit yourself deeply to something without having some sort of justification for it, right? I mean, there's got to be some reason why you're doing that.
Sure.
And importantly, I think it's also worth pointing out that loyalties aren't set in stone.
Right.
You can justifiably withdraw your loyalty if the object of your loyalty changes drastically, if it does something or becomes something, that's no longer worthy of that kind of commitment.
Yeah.
Or your loyalties can also be overridden, by other more pressing moral obligations. So, for example, your loyalty to your family might, understandably take precedence over, your loyalty to, your recreational soccer team, for instance.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. You mentioned earlier you sort of threw out this phrase of unsentimental loyalties. And one of the examples that I think a lot of people will probably immediately jump to is something like, a lawyer's loyalty to their client.
Right.
And that seems like a different kind of beast altogether, right?
It is. And so in those kinds of situations, the motivation for being loyal is not necessarily, affection or love or something like that, but rather it's a commitment to the shared goals of the professional relationship.
Okay.
Or to, some kind of fundamental principles of the association itself. So in the case of the lawyer, they're committed to the legal system, right? And their loyalty to their client is it's part of that larger commitment.
Right. So there really is, it's like a conscious choice almost.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, I'm entering into this relationship, or I'm joining this group, and because of the nature of that, I'm going to be expected to have, this sort of loyalty, even if I don't necessarily feel it in some kind of emotional way.
Right, exactly. Yeah. It's driven by the goals and the nature of that relationship itself.
Okay, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Now, it makes you wonder though, right? I mean, where does this drive for loyalty even come from?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, like, why are we like this? Like, why are humans like this? Is there any sort of like evolutionary explanation for this?
Yeah. So some evolutionary thinkers have proposed that that loyalty might have its roots in our evolutionary history.
Okay.
And the thought is that maybe it was an ingrained tendency for group cohesion, right?
Yeah.
That improved our chances of survival, right? I mean, if individuals were willing to sacrifice for the good of the group, well, then that might have made the group as a whole more likely to survive. But of course, we're not just, mindless creatures acting on instinct.
Right.
We're beings that are capable of reflection. And so, our understanding of loyalty today and the way that we practice loyalty is likely, far more nuanced and complex than, whatever its origins might have been. I mean, so, whatever it once was and whatever it is now, those two things might not be identical.
Right. Okay. So we've got this kind of general sense then of what loyalty is, but then we also talk about specific loyalties.
Right.
And so I'm curious, what's the difference there? Like, what are we really talking about when we make that distinction?
Yeah. So think of it this way. Loyalty is sort of the overall capacity for faithful allegiance. It's the potential to be loyal. Whereas loyalties are the specific ways that capacity gets directed. Right. Okay. So your loyalty to your friends, your loyalty to your family, your loyalty to your company, your loyalty to your country.
Right. Okay.
These are all specific loyalties.
Right. Right. So it's not just that, we happen to be a member of a group and therefore we're loyal to that group.
Right, exactly.
It's that we see something in that group that we really value.
Right, and these specific loyalties, they tend to be directed towards associations that we intrinsically value, right?
Wow.
Ones that we deeply identify with, to the point where their well-being and our own well-being, they become intertwined in our minds. And
Yeah.
and you can even see this in the language that we use, right? We talk about my friends, my family, our nation.
Right.
And so it's that sense of connection, right? That sense of shared fate, that I think really fuels loyalty. We feel a personal investment in the successes and the setbacks of the things that we're loyal to.
Yeah. Now, this idea of ours, I think that brings up an interesting point, right? Because it almost seems like loyalty is inherently about creating some kind of, us versus them dynamic.
Right.
Is it always exclusionary?
Yeah, that's a common perception.
Yeah.
That to be loyal to one thing implies that there's some other thing that you're potentially in opposition to.
Right.
And in many cases that's certainly true. I mean, a lot of times loyalty manifests itself when there's some kind of challenge, right? When you have to take sides, and your commitment to one side might, come at a cost relative to the other side. But I think it's important to note that it's not always about some kind of external rival. Sometimes loyalty just means acting in the best interest of whatever it is you're loyal to, even if it involves some sort of, personal inconvenience or even sacrifice.
Yeah.
And there's not necessarily any kind of direct competitor, involved there. I mean, think about, if a friend calls you, in the middle of the night and they need help with something, right?
Right.
I mean, well, your loyalty to them, might require you to get out of bed and go and help them.
Yeah.
And there's no other person or group that you're actively resisting in that moment.
Right.
It's more that, maybe the temptation to act disloyally is coming from your desire to just stay in bed and get a good night's sleep.
Right. Right. So while loyalty often does operate in these situations where interests might be in conflict,
Right.
that's not a necessary component.
Exactly.
Okay, that's helpful. That clarifies things a lot. So let's dive into this tension then, right?
Yeah.
Between our loyalties to specific people or groups, and our sort of broader obligations to everyone. This universalism versus particularism debate. This seems like this is really kind of at the heart of a lot of the philosophical discussions about loyalty.
It's really central.
Yeah.
And loyalty generally is considered a particularistic obligation, right? It's a specific duty that you have towards those you're loyal to, and that's contrasted with a universalistic duty, which is something that you owe to all people simply by virtue of their shared humanity. So, for example, the obligation not to lie, that's usually considered a universalistic obligation,
Right.
right? It doesn't matter who you're talking to, you shouldn't lie to them.
Right.
Whereas, loyalty is more like, you owe this to your friends and family, but you don't owe it to just anybody you happen to meet on the street.
Right. And so this really kind of highlights, I think, a fundamental, human challenge, which is how do we balance these deep-seated connections that we have with certain people and groups, with our broader responsibilities to humanity as a whole?
Yeah.
It's kind of a tightrope walk, right?
Yeah.
There's no easy answers here.
Yeah. And it sounds like, philosophers have really wrestled with this, right? Like, how do these two types of obligations, how do they relate to each other?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so can our particular loyalties, can they be justified by some kind of broader universal principle?
Yeah.
Or do they have their own kind of independent moral weight? And then what happens when they come into conflict? Say your responsibility to your family versus, your responsibility to assist, someone who's in dire need halfway across the world. How do we resolve that?
Right. Thinkers like William Godwin, the utilitarian, he famously questioned why my relationship should hold any more moral weight than impartial truth or universal well-being.
Yeah.
He thought we should be just as concerned for the well-being of strangers as we are for the well-being of our own loved ones.
Right. But then there have been arguments that try to, to push back on that a little bit, to kind of make space for these, these special particular loyalties.
Exactly, yeah. So, Andrew Oldenquist, for example, he argued that our loyalties actually define the boundaries of our moral communities.
Okay.
And it's within those communities that principles of impartiality then operate. So his thought is that, morality, in a sense, starts locally. It starts with the people that we're closest to.
Okay.
And then Bernard Williams, he emphasized the risk of universalistic demands alienating us from what he called our ground projects, right? So these are the deeply personal commitments that we have, often, underpinned by loyalty, that really give our lives meaning. And Williams was worried that, if we always prioritize the universal, then that might actually lead us to be alienated from the things that matter most to us.
Right, right. So how have philosophers tried to sort of reconcile these two things?
Right.
Because it does seem like they're kind of, in tension with each other.
Yeah.
On the one hand, we've got this, this pull towards, caring for everyone equally. And on the other hand, we've got these very, very specific, commitments to specific individuals and groups. So how do we make sense of that?
Right. Well, so there have been a number of different approaches. So one approach has been to try to show that actually, fostering particularistic loyalties can lead to greater overall well-being.
Okay.
So this is the kind of approach that the consequentialist R.M. Hare, for instance, took. So his classic example here is maternal love, right?
Okay.
So his thought is, if mothers were equally devoted to all children, well, then actually the level of care that they provided for their own children might suffer, right?
Right.
And so in the end, everybody might be worse off. Peter Railton, also a consequentialist, he argued that there can be perfectly sound, consequentialist reasons for acting on particularistic preferences.
Okay.
And he made a distinction between what he called the subjectively consequentialist perspective and the objectively consequentialist perspective.
Okay.
So the thought here is that, actually maximizing the good in the world might sometimes require that we don't constantly try to calculate, what's going to produce the most good in every single action that we take. Right. That actually there's a kind of space for genuine loyalty within a consequentialist framework.
Oh, okay. So it's like it's almost like there's two different levels of consequentialism.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's the individual level where you're trying to figure out, okay, what's the best thing for me to do in this particular situation,
Right.
and then there's sort of the bigger picture level,
Right. Exactly.
where it's like, well, actually, if everybody acted that way, maybe that wouldn't actually be the best thing for the world as a whole.
Right.
Okay, that's a really subtle but important distinction. Now, what about philosophers who aren't consequentialists?
Right.
Are there other ways to try to reconcile these two things?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Alan Gerwerth, for instance, who is a non-consequentialist, he based his ethical system on the principle of equal rights to freedom and well-being.
Yeah.
So everyone, has an equal right to freedom and well-being. And his thought was that, this actually allows us to form close-knit groups, like families,
Yep.
as long as those groups, don't trample on anybody else's fundamental rights. So, your loyalty to your family is perfectly fine as long as it doesn't, lead you to harm your neighbor, for instance.
Right.
And so for Gerwerth, these kinds of voluntary associations, including ones that are based on loyalty, they're not just, useful tools for maximizing, well-being or anything like that. They're actually expressions of our fundamental freedom.
Okay.
Right. They're ways of exercising our freedom to associate with others.
Okay. So it really does seem like there's not one easy answer here.
Right.
Right. It's a real philosophical puzzle how to fit these two things together.
It is. And in fact, some philosophers have even suggested that particularistic obligations like loyalty might be what's called sui generis, right?
Okay.
So sui generis just means like its own unique thing. Right. So it's not easily explained by breaking it down into some other, simpler parts.
Right.
Like think about the bond you have with a lifelong friend, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's something that's really unique and special, and you can't really explain it by just breaking it down into its component parts.
Right.
And so the thought is that, maybe loyalty is kind of like that. It arises not solely from our shared humanity, but from our social nature and the way in which our bonds with others, and especially our friendships, contribute to our sense of self and our sense of fulfillment. And so if that's the case, then the value of these loyalties, it's not reducible to some more fundamental, universal principle.
Okay.
Right. It's something that has its own kind of unique value.
Okay. Now, so far we've talked about, who typically shows loyalty.
Right.
We talked about the special case of animals.
Right.
But now I want to talk about the things that we can be loyal to.
Okay.
Right. And I know that it's not always just individuals.
Right. Yeah. So, we most often, of course, think of loyalty as being directed towards people, right?
Yeah.
Our friends and family, and to close-knit groups like families.
Yeah.
And to organizations, that kind of almost feel like they're entities in themselves, or, like a sports team or a company or something like that. But I think the philosophical debate really gets interesting when we start to think about whether you can be truly loyal to abstract things.
Right.
Things like principles or causes or ideals.
Mm-hmm.
And this was, Josiah Royce, who we mentioned earlier. He famously argued that at its core, loyalty is always devotion to a cause.
Okay. So what would be the argument against that kind of loyalty? Loyalty to an abstract thing.
Yeah, so those who favor a more kind of person-centered view of loyalty, they contend that we already have perfectly good terms to describe our commitment to abstract ideas.
Okay.
We have words like commitment, devotion, and in the case of loyalty to principles, well, the concept of integrity, I think, seems to fit there.
Right.
And so their thought is that loyalty in its truest sense really requires a kind of relational connection.
Okay.
It's about beings, not just ideas.
Okay.
Right. So you can be committed to an idea, but you're not really loyal to it.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. But even when it is towards a person or a group, I mean, isn't there usually some kind of like underlying alignment of values there?
Right, exactly. So when we're loyal to someone or something, there's usually this kind of implicit understanding that they, at least in some fundamental way, align with our own core values, right?
Right.
So if that alignment breaks down significantly, well, then that might give us reason to either, try to bring about change within the object of our loyalty, right? Which is what Albert Hirschman famously called voice, to use your voice to try to change things, or it might give us reason to ultimately withdraw our loyalty, which is what he called exit.
Right.
And so that shared sense of values, I think, often provides the kind of the bedrock for our commitment. It's why we're willing to stick with, the people and groups that we're loyal to.
Okay, so this brings us to, I think, a really interesting question, which is loyalty itself a virtue, right? Because, I mean, it feels like a positive quality.
Right.
I mean, nobody wants to be called disloyal, but, on the other hand, we also hear that saying about, organizations valuing loyalty over integrity.
Right, exactly.
Which makes you wonder, like, what are we really dealing with there?
Yeah, that cynicism, I think, really does get to the heart of the debate about loyalty. Is it inherently a virtue?
Right.
Or can it be so easily misdirected, that its moral status becomes questionable?
Right.
And R. Ewan, for instance, he argued pretty forcefully that loyalty is not a virtue.
Okay.
Precisely because it can be directed towards harmful ends.
Okay.
So you can be loyal to, a criminal enterprise, for instance.
Right.
And because it can demand that we set aside our own good judgment. So sometimes loyalty requires us to do things that we know aren't really right. And so Ewan's thought was that the value of loyalty is entirely dependent on the value of what it's directed towards.
Okay.
So if you're loyal to something good, then that's good.
Right.
But if you're loyal to something bad, well, then that's bad.
Right. But then there are counter-arguments to this view, right? I
Yeah.
mean, because it does seem kind of extreme to say that loyalty can never be a virtue.
Right, right. So one response to Ewan's argument is to point out that actually lots of other virtues, that we
Right.
we we generally consider to be